Okay, thank you.
Okay, standard UADC rules apply. Please offer and receive POIs between the first and 6th minute. I will time you, but I will not be putting it in the chat. So please time yourselves and your fellow speakers so that you don't offer POIs during protected time. If there are no questions, I invite the Prime Minister to open the debate. Here. I also look very sick, so I'm just gonna turn off my camera.
Shireen, you're killing it, Queen. Okay, let me get out a timer.
I think the hand, foot, and mouth is killing me, to be fair.
Aw. Women's dominated sports should be more culturally relevant and more people should participate in them. That is a good thing, and that is what happens when you advertise primarily to men. That's why we will win the debate. A couple of pieces of setup. First, how we will do this, what the interests of, I guess, women's dominated leagues are broadly, why the strategy of advertising counterfactually to women has diminishing marginal returns, and why this is probably the only effective strategy at maximizing or increasing participation in these sports, why this advertising will work, and finally, why this uptake will be useful. Let's start with that. How we will do it. In terms of micro-targeting the messaging, obviously we have the capacity to walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. There are different categories of men and there are different categories of reasons people want to participate in sport. So when advertising to a local community, like at a university or a local gymnasium, for instance, we might emphasize the fact that women's sports are fun and community-based, and that it's a non-judgmental way to do exercise. For instance, at UCID, at the local gym, netball, co-ed netball is super popular, and that would be the way we would advertise the sport in that group of people. But also we would advertise during male football games to probably more macho or masculine audiences. And the kinds of way that we would emphasize the virtues of women's sport in that setting would be to emphasize, for instance, that gymnastics is a really rigorous form of whole body exercise, and that it's incredibly hard to do 2 flips and 2 twists at the same time and land on your feet. And it's an incredibly fun and also challenging thing to do, which should be taken seriously as maybe just a form of conditioning or exercise, or at least just as an athletic pursuit generally. And so that's how we'd advertise to that group. But also, if we're talking about like a local, not even just like people of the same age, just like a gym where everyone in your local community goes, we would speak to parents in the way of emphasizing that enrolling your young boy in netball or in men's gymnastics, as I did actually as a young kid, is a pretty safe and injury-free way to have your kid be enjoying sport and getting the benefits of exercise. So for instance, most of these sports are non-contact. Many of them can be done in an individual way with highly supervised coach supervision, which means that many of these sports actually seem viscerally less injury risky. And that's the way we would advertise it to that kind of parent who's choosing what they're going to enroll their kid in. And so that's how we would do it. The interests of the set of people who we think, of these leagues would be, one, obviously, I think it's funding. Like, this debate will be won and lost on that question. Like, if we can get more viewers, more participants in it, more funding will go into leagues, either through the form of enrolling and becoming members in local gyms that funds the upkeep of that and funds the overall amount of money, but also the cultural relevance to watch more advanced and more top level versions of this that feeds into the leagues themselves. And clearly cultural relevancy comes subservient to that, but is somewhat apart from that in the sense that, you know, if you're a guy or a person who runs the netball league, you probably care quite a bit about netball being relevant because you think it's an awesome sport. Okay, let's get into the actual arguments then. First, why the current strategy has diminishing marginal returns of advertising primarily to women. And that is because the set of sports that are female dominated are actually pretty small. Like there aren't that many of them. And the existing ones are extremely culturally coded as women's sports. Like 40% of young girls in Australia play netball. And so it's just assumed that if you're a young girl wanting to play sport, which is the vast majority of kids, because sport is fun and it allows you to hang out with your friends, that there are networking effects that you probably, almost certainly, if you're a girl growing up, know someone who is also doing netball. And so your access to information as a girl about women's sport is extremely high already. You know its virtues, you know its rules, you know what's fun about it, which means that advertising or expending resources on advertising to women is a fairly useless errand. And it means that it's extremely likely you're preaching to a person who knows enough information or knows enough about it to make an informed decision, which means your advertising is extremely unlikely to be persuasive to that group of people. By contrast, advertising to men, a group who you have not primarily advertised to as you are a female-dominated sport, is an extremely likely to be effective strategy because you've not done it before, and there are a set of reasons why people can be persuaded to the virtues of these sports. In terms of the parents of young boys, I think that's fairly obvious. Yes, this can be advertised as safe, and increasingly the fears of sport being injurious to kids and the trends of gentle parenting mean that that's probably going to be a persuasive argument to some parents of young boys. Cultural gender norms are increasingly being eroded. See the fact that a lot of people see it as pretty cringe to have a gender celebration party, and so lots of parents are seeking ways to raise their kids that aren't incredibly gendered. This is probably a way that you could facilitate people who are going along with that trend, enrolling their kids in a way that would not do that. So I think this is probably likely to be persuasive to the parents of some young boys, but it's also likely to be persuasive to some adult men, right? Because these sports are interesting. Like watching gymnastics is super interesting, both as a form of exercise, conditioning, incredibly difficult physical pursuit, but it's a super fun thing to do with your body. Like last night I was doing cartwheels and it was like so much fun, right? And I think you could just persuade people that that is something really fun. I think a lot of adult men are screaming out for fun things to do with their life and just should do it. I'll take a POI.
So how do you get men to overcome their initial prejudices of the fact that this is a woman's sport?
Well, some men have prejudices, but some men don't. Like, there are lots of people who could just be persuaded by information about a sport that it is interesting and fun. But a lot of this also happens at the level of enrolling you before you've been incredibly pilled on masculinity when you're a young boy, and you don't have those cultural notions to make you think that it's a women's sport, so I shouldn't do it. Also, like, a lot of people at like age 19 to 23, right, are screaming out for opportunities to engage with people of the opposite sex. The way to persuade people to do this is often in a non-judgmental co-ed sports team that lots of people actually have a demand for. And these sports are extremely well placed to fill that demand for people, which means that it is extremely persuasive to them. So lots of demographics of people could find information about these sports persuasive to them, wanting to do it and wanting to watch these sports more. That uptake is incredibly useful on the basic level because convincing male voters to watch and to gamble and to think about women's sports is disproportionately useful than convincing a woman voter, because men voters are far more sport motivated than are women voters. They watch it far more, they gamble on it far more, they care far more about where government funding to sports goes. So it follows then that one male voter convinced to care a lot about funding for women's gymnastics would be far more useful than 10 women voters who are persuaded for the same thing, who are already saturated. For that reason, the uptake is incredibly useful. It increases membership, increases participation. It's great. Awesome.
Sorry, I don't know if I was unmuted, but thanks, Prime Minister Elo.
Okay, just give me a second. The first thing I want to explain is that they can't claim that they just want men to take part in sports recreationally, because the reality is because if it's true that they just want men to take part in this female-dominated sports recreationally, the net change under their side is incredibly small. But even if it's the case that they actually want to get short-term recreational players to join this kind of sports, the reality is that men don't play these kinds of sports because there are narratives that say that these are women's sports. And if they take part in these kinds of sports, they are seen as less masculine men, and therefore they are dissuaded from playing these kinds of sports. Therefore, in order for them to attract male players and to attract male participation within these kind of sports, it requires these sporting associations to reshape the narrative surrounding these female-dominated sports. And that requires them to take on an additional higher burden in this debate, which means to say that they need to do things like exclusive masculine advertisements in order to take apart this current narrative that exists in order to attract more men to take part in these sports. It also means that they have to divert resources from female players to take away spotlight from existing female players into these sports to focus more on existing male players within these places to take away from the narrative that these sports are female-dominated sports. With that said, what exactly changes in this debate? We think that often these sporting associations are able to have a dominance over female sports because they are able to appeal to more women, because they show women that this is a sport that they are able to excel and succeed in. This is how you attract more women into these kinds of sports. There are a few reasons, and the reality is that this dominance is important for two important reasons. The first is that in the event where these sports no longer appeal to women or are unseen as dominated by women, women are likely to go into other alternatives within their lives. That is to say that if a female sport player wants to play sports for a living, they are likely to turn towards other kinds of sports out there, for instance, like football or basketball that aren't female dominated, but presumably can earn them much more money because there's greater viewership counts in general. So they would rather turn to those kind of sports rather than turn towards existing female-dominated sports like figure skating or netball. Secondly, in the event where if, let's say, they are not a sportswoman and they are thinking about whether they should, go and become a sportswoman, they are likely to choose to take part in traditional career paths. For instance, working a 9 to 5 job in the office that can earn them money rather than playing these kinds of sports competitively at all. Therefore, as a whole, this dominance is important because you're able to show women that there is a clear path towards being a sportswoman, that they can succeed in these kinds of roles. And in the event where you do not have this dominance over these kinds of female sports, where it's not female dominated, it's a point where women are likely to turn towards other alternatives that already exist. The problem with this, therefore, is that at the point in which they put in where they try to focus on more men, there are two issues that exists. The first issue is that there's likely to be toxic comparisons between men and women. That is to say that when more men participate within these kinds of female-dominated sports, there are likely to be comparisons made between male and female athletes. It's likely the case that male athletes are going to be seen as superior to female athletes. They're going to be seen as more athletic than them, and therefore the ability of these sporting associations to showcase these kinds of sports as female-dominated, female-centric or female-dominated sports gets lost in the process. And the reason why, and even if it's the case that these sporting associations are benevolent and they are not trying to create these kinds of narratives, the problem is that the ability to control how women, female and male athletes are perceived is lost at the point in which people on the ground make these kinds of comparisons, as we've seen in other kinds of sports like football, for instance. That is to say that, for instance, when more male fans enter these kinds of sports and they start participating either as participants or athletes, it's a point where they make comparisons between male and female athletes, and that's where they create toxic narratives explaining that men are better than female athletes in these kinds of sports. So you lose that kind of dominance. You lose female viewership and female participation as a whole. Secondly, at the point in which more men enter these kinds of sports, you also take away the safe spaces of women to exist in these places. That is to say that at the point where women are able to interact with one another in their own communities and are able to control the discussions surrounding these kinds of sports, this gets lost when more men enter because they are then able to take over these kinds of discussions. They are able to determine how the sport necessarily evolves or change. And note, this also responds to a lot of PM's framing, because PM tells you that men are better because they spend more money and they're more invested sports watchers. If this is true, then this all the more means that men are likely to be the ones who control narratives within these female-dominated sports already, which means to say that they then have the ability to push more women out because these sports are no longer seen as catering to women. The problem with this is that at the point where you get less female participants in terms of joining the sports and in terms of watching the sports, there are two harms to this. The first harm is that you get a lesser quality of play because your players are going to be far worse, given the fact that most women don't want to take on the path of becoming a female athlete within this kind of sports. But secondly, you're likely to lose out on a lot of female viewership because they no longer see these sports as a sport that is viable for women. They are unable to relate to these sports because of the fact that there's a predominance on masculine advertising, or the fact that you see more men being propped up over women. So naturally, these sporting associations also lose things like revenue, for instance, or the ability to capture a large audience. Before I continue, I'll take one POI.
Yeah, your claim that women don't want to be compared to men and so will opt out of these sports is at tension with your claim that netball is currently bleeding women to soccer because soccer is more lucrative. Can you explain that tension, please?
No, my point is this. My point is that right now, because these female-dominated sports are seen as viable career paths for women, that's why women will join. But in the event where it's not seen as where it's not like prestigious to play in these kinds of where it's not seen as like how do I say, like very viable career path, that's when they turn towards other sports that are presumably more lucrative than netball and other sports like this, than other female-dominated sports. Let's then talk about like why, like in terms of weighing, because I think that it's quite difficult for them to actually try to encourage more male participants to participate in these kinds of sports, given the existing narratives that already exist. For that reason, the risk that you are taking in terms of trying to capture this audience is quite high in regards to the speculative returns that you will get. And for that reason, it's because the risk is high, you ought to prioritize like current strategies of trying to ensure that you get a loyal follower base, a loyal audience base that's going to continue watching your sports and take part in your sports in general. Secondly, we think that female participation is still better than male participation, insofar as they are more long-term loyal bases, going to continue playing this sport and going to continue investing money into this sport through watching it as a whole. Whereas men are likely to be more short-termist, given that there are other kinds of sports that exist. They're probably going to turn to those other kinds of sports and won't give more of their time towards these female-dominated sports. For these reasons, we oppose.
Thank Ella for that speech. DPM.
Give me 1 second. Move this space. You move over.
Yeah, sorry.
Can I get one?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me? Cool. This team says you should prioritize their benefits because they have greater certainty. But let's look at what they're actually certain of. Women's sport is certainly bleeding viewers and bleeding participants towards male sports, where parents can send their children to play co-ed games with other boys and girls, and where men and women can play together like they want to. Women's sport is certainly losing a lot of cultural relevance towards male-dominated sports that appear to be more important to governments and appear to be more important to people. What our side brings you is the only meaningful solution towards these problems, which is making them up to date with what people actually want right now and advertising towards markets that are actually untapped, rather than constantly pandering to an oversaturated audience that is already aware that your sport exists and is already aware that they have the potential to play it, but is choosing not to. 2 questions in the speech. Firstly, will this work? Secondly, if it worked, would it be good? And then after that, I'll whip some benefits. Firstly, let's talk about if this would work. What does this team say? I think they say two things, the second of which is a bit disjointed, but I'll get to that later. Their central claim is just men don't want to play these sports because they don't want to feel like they aren't masculine people. A few responses to this. Number one, I think a lot of the reason why it feels emasculating at the moment is because it's exclusively being pandered towards women. That is, all the advertising that people have ever seen around playing netball or playing volleyball has been advertising explicitly targeted towards women, and that's the cultural impression that these sports have at the moment. A lot of that is resolved at the point where you advertise towards men. But it's also resolved based on the way that you choose to advertise towards men. So the way that you, for example, would say that when you target towards groups of men or at men's gymnasiums or places that men are, and you advertise these sports to them, you would obviously advertise them in different ways, which I think substantially resolves this problem. But secondly, and more importantly, I think the issue with this is not all men care exclusively about appearing masculine, and it's not people's first order concern in every instance to be as masculine as possible. I think this is firstly increasingly untrue in liberalizing societies where men actually find it helps and benefits them to appear less masculine because they don't want to be as intimidating and they don't want to be as macho all the time. But even outside of those contexts, I just don't think it's always true that men primarily care about appearing masculine towards other people, and this team certainly doesn't do sufficient analysis to prove that. But also, I think a lot of this debate occurs in the context of young children. And in those instances, I think parents have a very active priority to prevent their children from becoming hypermasculine, because you don't want to raise a boy that is super macho. And you as a child obviously haven't been exposed nearly as significantly towards a desire to be masculine, which means your aversion to playing a sport like netball or engaging in a sport like gymnastics is substantially less than the adult men that this team rests their case on. So I think there are a lot of men out there who we can advertise these sports to. And sure, I'm willing to concede that not every man on earth is going to convert to becoming a netball player. And there are a subset of men who will probably never play netball. But there are a large group of people that you should know personally exist in the world who would probably be okay with playing these kinds of sports. Not every man that you know personally is hypermasculine. Therefore, I think it's pretty obvious that not all men have this strong aversion towards playing sports that are dominated towards women. And that's probably a benefit for our side, because it also explains why the selection effect that occurs of the subset of men who choose to opt in these sports have a positive contribution towards those sports in the long run. But thirdly, I just think we can persuade the set of men that these sports are good. There are a lot of benefits which I think appeal even towards hypermasculine men. That is, for example, things like playing sports with women who men want to hang out with, and that they only get the opportunity to do, or get the opportunity to do substantially more when they engage in female-dominated sports, which is why, for example, at universities, things like co-ed netball are super popular because men want to hang out with women and women want to hang out with men, which is why they choose to play co-ed netball instead of segregating into different sports. This is extremely successful. Empirically, it's been successful, and you should know people who this would be successful towards. The next and more disjointed claim they make is, well, women want to play sports like football because it's more lucrative. So you can't, for some reason, advertise this in this way. Two responses to this claim. Firstly, I think this is true, like obviously on both sides. Like whether or not you advertise towards women, the decision calculus that if I became a professional footballer, I'd make more money than if I became a professional netball is always going to be true. And you can't trick people out of believing that with advertising. Like the counterfactual advertising you would do towards young girls is not going to be able to persuade them that they can be a mega rich netball player, because netball players aren't rich and most of them have to have second jobs because they have less cultural relevance. But secondly, I would observe that this problem gets substantially worse on side negative, because the less cultural relevance that a sport has, the less it's being discussed by men and women and being prioritized as something that is good in society, the less people perceive that as being something which can become a viable and important career. So if your concern is people don't want to play sports that lack cultural relevance and seem less important, the worst thing you could do is segregate that to being played by only half the population, having only half the population care about it. What that should prove to you is I think this obviously will work. It will attract a large number of men. I'll take the PY.
So many of these women see women's sports as a way to get safe space. Why is it okay to let men specifically who want to interact with women to be allowing them to go in these spaces?
There are two sets of women in this debate. One set of women who wants to interact with men. I would argue that constitutes the vast majority of men. Lots of women are normal human beings who like interacting with other human beings, and the human beings include men. That set of people probably joins co-ed netball. Gendered netball doesn't cease to exist because you open a new division that has mixed gendered netball. those women can still choose to play segregated sport, and the set of advertising they're exposed to is probably more likely to be advertising towards that gendered sport. They never lose their safe space. And I think given these groups are probably pretty equal in size, it's not as if rediverting resources towards mixed gendered netball means that women can't access a safe space, because a lot of the women opt out of the gendered version of the sport because their preference is to be in the mixed gendered co-ed sport. So yes, you're diverting resources towards mixed gendered sport, but you're also getting a lot of extra revenue from all the signups that men do, and also a lot of the women are choosing to participate in it. Let's talk about why this is good then, because I think this is where this team is weakest analytically. They say, well, women don't want to be don't want to play the sport if it's not seen to be catering towards women anymore because it's full of men. Firstly, I would observe for the reason already explained in response to that POI that is attractive to a lot of women. This team observes the empirical reality that women's sport is sometimes bleeding participation towards male-dominated sports and the women's divisions of those, but never ask why that is. The reason is because men exist in those spaces, and that is appealing to a lot of people. But secondly, I think we can obviously keep some of those spaces towards men. Next, they say men will ruin this space for women, but the response to this is super obvious. Firstly, it's the selection effect that I previously described. The subset of men who choose to enter these spaces are one who are least persuaded by the idea that they should be hyper-masculine, and therefore they're unlikely to ruin those spaces. But secondly, I just think it's untrue that men always ruin every space that they enter. A lot of these can become constructive places where both men and women become better people. I think it's beneficial to raise girls and boys in co-ed environments and give them exposure to each other, and that isn't necessarily a harm, and this team needs to do some actual analysis to prove why it would be.
All right, thanks, DPM. Diallo.
Hello, Shireen, can you hear me?
Hello, yeah, Ken.
Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. In my speech, I just want to flag out the comparative and then do some weighing. So what do they want? They want to market to men and boys for participation. And the reason why they claim this will be successful is that the gender norms are changing, that there's information failure, and that people potentially like non-combat sports, so there's a potential market. I think these are casual observations on various sections of society. I don't think this actually proves why the campaign is likely to be successful. I have 3 reasons why it's likely to be very cost ineffective, if not fail outright. The first is they are exaggerating. It's likely to be the case that a lot of this education is very currently being done. If it's the case that your gymnasium wants to make money, I think they're not very discriminative regarding whether is it the case that they don't want to market specifically to men or women. So for most gymnastics stadiums out, like training grounds out there, you see likely a mix of men and women because naturally you want to make money the same way you see, for example, a boxing class. Even if it's the case that it's catered towards men, it's likely to be the case that they still try to market to women because they want to survive. Think about ladies' hour or after lunch classes for the white collar class. The second is that if it's the case that a lot of these sports are non-contact, actually these sports have a lot of exposure in school. And the reason for that is because you don't want to get the kids to get hurt during physical education. So most boys would have actually played netball or badminton in secondary school because not every boy out there can just suddenly start shooting hoops. So people do in fact know that these sports exist. Most people have in fact tried their hands at this sport at once or twice in their life. The second is that they have to accept that inertia is somewhat strong and therefore cost effectiveness is low. We're not saying that it won't work. We're just saying it's going to be immensely expensive. The reason for that is because if it's the case that you want your kid to do a non-contact sport because you're afraid of them getting hurt, I think you're not likely to get your kid to do very serious sports at all. I think general exercise is something that's likely sufficient, or maybe just send him outside and play with a dog or something. The second is if it's the case that perhaps maybe it's the case that gender norms are changing, but it's also about where. I think gender norms change the least in sport because of how far men have had their hands into these things. So it's potentially the case that there is some viability, but for the people that you actually want to convert, the people that are likely to grow up to become professional sports fans and then sink money to a league, these are the people that are the least difficult, most difficult for you to change your mind of. The next is, I think the bar for them to clear is very high, because at what point do we have enough boys experimenting with netball so that we can actually get long-term viewership revenue? So they don't actually answer this. They just generally say that we have more people participating. In the end, the league will benefit in some way. But I don't think that the relationship is very clear. On the flip side, we want to continue to market to women. They say that high awareness already happens, so therefore the delta is low. But my question is, what kind of awareness? Because they don't actually explain what do we do at the moment. Here's the things that we do. The first is to fund competitive high school competitions. The second is we give amateur athletes very lucrative sporting contracts to turn pro so that we can entice them to enter the league. Third is that we feature their achievements, their stories, so that most people will know who these individuals are. I think the point here is there's a nuance in awareness. The awareness we are talking about is not the awareness of the sport, because on both sides that's quite high, but it's the awareness on the cultural relevance of the sport, the way in which the pro circuit value add to these sports. I think these are the things that they have to do to comparative against. They have not done so. At this point, I just want to add two weighing points. And the first one is derivatively of the analysis I've done earlier. The question is, how do we get more money into our sport? They say that participation is the primary driver for money into the sport. But I would posit to you that is unlikely to be true. And the reason for that is because things like jump rope or things like badminton are things that most people have tried. I guess some people might talk about, but these sports are not likely lucrative. And the reason for that is because there's actually just not a lot of a strong correlation between participation and discussions. I actually think that most of the money comes from the cultural code. The idea that you're so intertwined with the sport and your identity that means a lot to you, that you're likely to be willing to sacrifice your time, your money, and of course, see a part of yourself in these individuals as performing at a task that you really like the most. And the reason for that is because these sacrifices to support a pro league is something that that has to be incurred against your will for a very artificial benefit, for a very cathartic impression of what the sport ought to be. If it's the case that you don't have the cultural code to manifest this meaning in the very first place, discussion alone is not going to create that. So the trade-off is, I think they want to expand the sport. On outside the house, we just want it to survive by continuously investing in this cultural code. And if it's the case that we already have the cultural code in women, then I posit to you that actually we have immense potential to monitor cultural code, because potentially it's the case that women play netball, but then they forget about it. The fact is that they do play in high school, but they never had the impression of going pro or see the superheroes doing very well in these places. So therefore, they don't think that there's any meaning in potentially continuing to follow the sport or supporting these women that actually do these things that are very inspiring to them. So what that means is that the money that we spend on outsides is in fact likely to be effective, particularly to make it so that women playing sports at the moment are likely to pursue and support long-term professional sport into the future. I think that has a stronger direct correlation to the benefit that we get as a professional league. Before I go on, I'll take the POI.
Yeah, you've spent a lot of time explaining that it's hard to persuade men to enjoy these sports, but you're uncomparative. If women culturally are so uninterested in paying to watch games or in becoming professional sports people, it's also difficult to persuade them to do that.
So I think it's about analytically thinking about what kind of inertia, and the inertia is an inertia towards what benefit. I think there are multiple inertias for you guys because there's just stronger competition elsewhere. So men can participate in other sports. There's also inertia in there are just more gaps. So just getting them to play more has a gap between them actually supporting the league. Whereas on outside the house, I think being able to feel empowered by a sport is quite exclusive. This is something that we have directly for them. It might be difficult at the moment, but nonetheless, it's something that's worthwhile to be tackled, and we can do this fairly exclusively. And once we are able to get there already, then the benefit to the league channels quite directly, at least on in comparison to the comparative. The next thing I want to talk about is what exactly is the problem facing these leagues, and what is the most important to focus on. I think you do not actually engage with our comparative on why is it the case that talent in the league is quite important. And the reason for that is because talent is basically what allows you to market yourself as a valuable league. Talent is the capacity by which you can drive more viewership and have more sporting stories to tell. The comparative that you quite have to make is that potentially is the case that insofar as we funnel less money into converting the top players from the varsity scene into the competitive scene, you lose out on these key players that become the face of your sport otherwise. And this is important because this directly affects your capacity to market yourself, directly affects the quality of your game. So if it's the case that I'm watching a professional game and I feel like my high school game in the past with this star player who was not converted was actually more competitive, then I'm more likely to write it off as something that's not worthwhile to pursue. And I think that has a much stronger correlation with the performance early as opposed to just general male participation. For all these reasons, please start with government opposition.
Thanks, Adiolo, for that speech. Government.
Hello.
Hi.
1 sec. First thing I want to do in this speech is just to explain why it's harder to persuade people to care about sport at all than it is to change their preferences about which sport they like once they already care about sport. And that's going to flip the claim that you hear in response to my point of information, which is, well, you've got two barriers, which is you have to make men kind of stop being toxically masculine and then also change their preferences, which are competitive, versus we just need to persuade women to suddenly care about sport. I'm going to explain why that latter task is actually very hard. A couple of observations. Firstly, I want to note that men are already, by their concession, extremely inculcated in the cultural practice of sport. They already do things like go to games. They form communities over sport. They bet on sport. They spend hours a week watching it. And what that means is that they're already in the practice of enjoying sport. You don't have to persuade them that sport is a fun thing that they like and they should spend money on. It's something which is already extremely culturally common that men already think a lot about. And that is incredibly important because it means that they have quite a large amount of room to think about sport, which means that it is not very difficult to persuade them to care about any one sport. And the reason you know this is just that lots of men like multiple sports, which means it is not necessarily competitive. You do not have to persuade them to stop liking soccer. You just have to persuade them to also like netball. Contrast that with persuading people to like sport when they currently do not. Women, the set of women who currently, I guess, don't play netball or don't do dancing, do not do so because they do not care about the sport. They think it's a waste of time. They think it's uninteresting. They do not have the habits and cultural practices that would make them enjoy it. It is not easy to overcome that. And I think that's the reason why this opposition team must lose this debate, because they're never comparative. They never mechanize why they're able to motivate a unique set of women who doesn't currently play these sports. Two things then that I'm going to do for the rest of this speech. Firstly, I will explain why we gain men, which I think wins the debate for a series of reasons I'll explain. And then I'll explain why we retain women. Firstly, on gaining men, I'm going to prove two things in this part of my speech. Firstly, I will explain that the difficulty of persuading additional men to join these sports is less than the difficulty of persuading additional women to join these sports, which I think wins the debate handily because it just explains that we get more people. But then I will be charitable and I'll explain even if it is the case that the difficulty of persuading men is larger, it is worth it. Firstly, the difficulty of persuading men is smaller than the difficulty of persuading women. I've already explained why I think opposition is just analytically uncomparative, which I think it's probably too late for them at WIF to suddenly explain how they persuade women. But I'm going to explain also why I think it's just not that hard to persuade men to play these sports. Negative's claim here is just insufficient. They just observe that some men would be uninterested in playing these sports. All right, some women would be uninterested in playing these sports, literally not useful, right? But also their status quo bias, they're some men currently uninterested in playing these sports. Sure, you can change preferences. But the other observation I want to make is just that we identify sets of men who would be interested in playing these sports in intricate detail in Oscar's speech. Oscar spends fucking 5 minutes explaining this to you, provides a huge suite of examples of sets of people who could potentially be persuaded and precisely how we would do it. And they just do not provide any individual response to that material, which should suggest to you that there are a large number of men who could be interested in playing these sports. We've provided the ways we can sell it to them. And the final thing I want to note here is just that set of men, while potentially interested in these sports, is not currently reached sufficiently by this advertising or by the sets of marketing that these sports do to people. And their response is just to be they know the sports exist. They might have played it in the school. Sure, maybe they've played it, but that firstly that indicates sometimes they do play it. But the other thing I would say is just obviously if they don't see leagues available to them, if they do not see this as something that they should do outside of school, if there just isn't a co-ed netball league in their area, they're not going to play it outside of school. So that is why clearly setting things up or doing additional advertising does have returns. These people are fertile ground for persuading to play. But I also want to note that girls are hard to persuade to play these sports, partly because they already know, so there's the diminishing marginal return impact that we describe in detail, but also I want to note that where girls do not play, they do not play often because they are just not sporty. They don't like sport. And it's hard to persuade them to suddenly like sport rather than to persuade a boy to pick up an additional sport when he already cares very much about being active and already loves sport. I'll take a point now.
So the point is that these sports have a cultural relevance that attracts women, and this relevance is lost under your side. Why is it justified to acquire a new audience that isn't guaranteed to participate in your sport long term?
So the problem is you haven't actually proved that you lose it because it's resting on an assertion that it makes it seem manly, but then your other claim is, no, these sports are so womanly, you can't make them seem manly. So that doesn't actually make sense. But the other thing I would say is you don't really explain where women would go. If women want to play sport for exogenous reasons, and this seems a bit more manly, where are they going to go? Soccer, you say that that's really manly. So I just don't get it. All right. Finally, I want to explain here that the difficulty of persuading men to play sport is just worth it. And that's to say, even if it's a bit harder to persuade men to play these sports than it is to persuade women, they are a very high value customer. That is because men are far more likely to do things like gamble on sport, to do things like write to local members, or like fucking, if they're a politician, take pictures with sports teams, etc. Because they are like culturally sport peeled, right? And women also have more important things to think about. But additionally, men are just more likely to do things like go to games. Men are more likely to watch sports. And ways I want to note in which you would persuade girls to play more sports is to do things like say, oh, it's healthy, it's a nice community activity. But the problem with that is those are not moneymakers. Men are, by and large, the most lucrative sport market. So even if we don't persuade as many of them, they just have enormous returns. And I want to note that that benefit is cyclical, because the more people you persuade to watch these sports, the more lucrative it becomes. And our opposition has conceded that being lucrative, that having viewership is something that persuades women to go into sport, which means you should believe that this is a cyclical benefit. That explains broadly why we gain more men and why that is the largest benefit in this debate. I'm now going to talk about women and why we retain them. Their key claim is that this is seen as a viable career path for women, and they provide a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, they're like, we're going to fund high schools. That's obviously symmetrical because they can see that boys play these sports in schools on their side of the house either way. Then they suggest, we'll provide lucrative scholarships to women. No, you don't. We live in reality. And then thirdly, they say, well, this is perceived as more culturally relevant. But the problem with that is they never explain by who or how. Just showing pictures of women playing netball doesn't actually like make it culturally relevant. If it is the case that, for instance, you can never actually go to a netball game with your boyfriend because he doesn't fucking care about netball, or you can never play with your male friends because there's no co-ed league, or you see all the adulation for women's sport going to, for instance, the Matildas rather than like whatever the netball team in Australia is. I literally don't know it because I watch soccer instead, or because you're repelled because it's culturally perceived as a girl's sport. You're sick of that shit. You don't just want to play things that are gender coded as being girls. They do not make how they make this happen, how they make it be seen as a viable career path. But crucially, we do, because they concede that girls currently are bleeding off to soccer because it's seen as a viable career path, because it's lucrative. The reason it is lucrative is because it has viewers, because people as a friend group that is co-ed are interested in going to the soccer. If like games are gendered as women, they are not lucrative and people do not go into them, which means that they are doomed. It is uniquely on side affirmative that we provide you with a path to make these lucrative. And that might be a slow process, but as I've explained, it's a cyclical one. That is why we win the debate.
Thanks, Government Whip. Up Whip.
Hi, am I audible?
Mm.
Okay. I want to discuss two things in this debate. The first is how do these safe spaces affect women? Secondly, on how these safe spaces affect men, and how how their policy worsens, and how this policy necessarily worsens, the behavior of men will worsen how these spaces will go. Lastly, I will just weigh specifically on the benefits and harms. Firstly, on safe spaces, the initial assumption is that these spaces have no these sports have no cultural relevance. I think this is patently untrue. I'll point out that this is actually where they're analytically also the weakest, because female-dominated sports are often actually having a large amount of spotlight, specifically in popular culture already. There's two reasons for this. The first is that women already break records that are already supersede men specifically within these sports. That's why many women actually go buy into these sports. So Simone Biles with the Tuyochenko twist, for example, has never been done by a man before. The fact that she has won many gold medals, the fact that many women gymnasts have American gymnasts have superseded records that have never been pushed by men, right? The idea here is that many of these female-dominated sports are female-dominated precisely because they are culturally significantly more relevant towards female athletes in general, and we spotlight their achievements. The second is because they break stereotypes. So Venus speaking out against sexist narratives, for example, and sexist interviewers, like tennis players actively speaking out against male referees. The upshot here is firstly, they already have high amounts of cultural relevance, given the fact that if you just open YouTube and have a live, most of these individuals you will already see even on your feed. Number two, that women are significantly already invested in women's sports precisely because they want to see their own kind succeed. I think all of these things are just pretty simple analytical weighing. The second assumption here is that women just really like interacting with men. This is absolutely nonsense. I'll suggest actually that most of these sports women don't want men within their spaces. And this includes the actors specifically as well. I will note that specifically in many sports associations, women's sports associations have seen how men have destroyed women when they are compared against other men. Look at the WNBA, for example, when they're like, the ball's so small, look at their big muscles. That clearly the men's portion is significantly more interesting. Look at how specifically women are often juxtaposed towards men in other sports like diving, for example. The biggest problem, therefore, is that most of the time when you reintroduce men into these spaces, that the comparison they make is often extremely toxic. The amount of body shaming that exists, the amount of comparisons that exist, the idea that many unqualified men make extremely unqualified assumptions about these things often suggests that introducing men is often not a good idea, specifically for the perception of women, specifically for women's sports, right? Like the idea here is that you make the safety of women significantly worse. Two, that also women see these sports as places of homosocial connections and interactions with other women, right? Especially when you see these places and sports as a way to escape not only these kinds of scrutiny, but also from just day-to-day life in general. That's why you have women-only gyms, for example. The idea here is that specifically for women's spaces and women's sports, then maybe many of these spaces actually serve the function of being an important safe space. Arguments made by Wayne and Tan never responded to. The upshot here is that their assumption here is that women are normal people who like interacting with men. Like the answer is context. The women join these sports precisely because it's a safe space away from men. The problem on their side is that they suggest that advertising specifically towards men by saying that you can find you can find a girlfriend, right? Specifically on their side of the house makes it significantly worse precisely because if you advertise specifically to men with the suggestion you can meet women, realize this invites a lot of unwanted attention as well. If your poster is saying play with netball girls to find girlfriend, intuitively this is horrific. Because when you have to accommodate to them. If you assume efficiency at its highest, and I'll buy them at their best case, and I'll concede that men have voting power, and I concede that they have viewership power, and it increases awareness of women, Tan argues this is precisely why it's the worst form of awareness. Precisely because that many of these spaces become significantly harder to regulate and call out bad behavior. Because now, if you alienate these men would threaten to pull out their membership and threaten to pull out how specifically they're going to interact with you. Therefore, the problem then becomes that the relevance becomes hinged on men, and therefore you need to cater to the whimsies of these particular men. Why is this harmful? Firstly, this is extremely harmful for women because it's harder to push back against bad behavior. Things like body shaming, things like, for example, comparisons to other men are often things that already exist on their side of the house that worsens as a result because you can't check and balance them. Two, but even if there are some men who are nice, it's giving not all men energy. Like the idea here is that the not all men problem exists on their side precisely because the assumption here is that many men are just very progressive now. Oh my God, this makes absolutely no sense, which leads me on to my next clash. So how do men react to this? The first thing they suggest is that this is fun generally. This is uncomparative, right? For two reasons. And the response the response is pretty simple. That you are competing with not only other sports that purport the same amount of fun, but you're also competing with pre-existing sports which are garnered in advertising by men for men. So it's not just gymnastics is fun in a vacuum. Even if you increase the funness of gymnastics, it doesn't supersede the fact that soccer has all my friends. It doesn't supersede the fact that I have a generational I see Ronaldo on TV, for example, so I want to be the next Ronaldo. The problem here is that many male individuals already have a perception of how specific of not only their own role models, but many of this is generational as well. The idea that your family wants you to go to rugby, for example, are all pressures which necessarily already exist and often compete against each other. Please don't let them get away with the fact that, but if we make something more fun, equals more people buy in because it must compete with other existing interests as well. But before I move on, I'll take the POI.
Kenzo Shirai can do a 3.5 Yurchenko in men's gymnastics, but people care far less than watching Simone Biles do a comparatively easier vault, a 2.5 Yurchenko. Why is that?
Yeah, so that's precisely why specifically you should focus on women's sports. Because if the idea here is if you put the 3.5 twist and you focus on the fact this dude can do a 3.5 twist, your Simone Biles gets ignored in the process and you concede to all our harms. So thank you for that POI, lovely. I think we win. Number two, they suggest that when you pivot towards men, you automatically get men to buy towards these things. That's like saying if you advertise dresses to men, suddenly men buy in. The reason this makes no sense is because oftentimes these things are are extremely conditioned already to see these sports as extremely bad and feminine. Many of these men as well don't have a legacy specifically of participating in these sports, which makes it worse. Number two, that people have become increasingly less gender norms. I reject the idea that children never internalize gender norms because majority of communities have entrenched gender norms, like pink for girls, blue for boys, cars for boys, dolls for girls. The idea is that gender norms are entrenched extremely young and are often generational, meaning that oftentimes it's extremely hard to buy in. But even if it's true that people are becoming more degendered, then why the hell are we even like diverting these resources towards advertising if these people automatically advertise for their boys to go to girls' sports anyways? Then there's no incentive if it's indeed true that many individuals are already increasingly gendered, therefore reducing necessity on their side. Lastly, on the worst case, even if it's true that on their side they have more men and more relevance, the problem is this comes at the cost of women's safety and relevance. One, women become significantly more vulnerable because they have no safe space on the comparative versus men who have various other alternatives. Two, that women oftentimes lose relevance in the sporting scene and arena, making it significantly worse as compared to these men who will make them significantly more unsafe. For all these reasons, opposition.
Thank opposition whip for that speech. I'll reply.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, 3, 2, 1. So Sydney is quite brilliant, but I think this debate doesn't require you to be brilliant. You just have to be an idiot, and the reason for that is because an average sport fan is an idiot. Just reasonably think about how an idiot would fork up $50 for a pay-per-view. This has to be the tipping point in terms of the impact. I think being able to play sports more in high school doesn't give the league any more money. Having more discussions around the sport doesn't necessarily give the league any more money. Feeling like a sport is more gender neutral isn't going to give the league any more money. So, like, the sports that do pass out of these bars don't actually make a lot of money either. So, like, jump rope and badminton aren't like the most profitable sport in the world. Additionally, like, your liberal race, progressive, non-contact participating men don't they're not likely to bet on sport. I don't know how to prove this to you. Like, Wayne bets on sport, not these individuals. My point here is just that there's a big discrepancy between what they set out to do and why are these things effective, and then why are these things likely to benefit the sport league as a whole. If it's the case that you're getting pitched this as a business decision, there's no way you buy this because it's just so unclear as to why is it the case that you eventually get any kind of benefits. I think the comparative on our side of the house is quite realistic and quite relevant. We told you that this money is uniquely built for cultural relevance. We have to create this to monetize the cultural relevance as of the moment, so that people who have some exposure to the sport and like the sport already are likely to then spend money on the sport. We do things like, for example, investing in the varsity circuit to find out talent, to make it so that they continue to play the sport, to develop that talent into the pro league. We give them contracts. We get a response from WIP saying that the scholarship doesn't exist because this is a real world. I'm not sure why that is the response, but just think about the fact that we have more money to just offer the top player in high school so that they can turn pro. These players with the most reach, these players with the regional community supporting them because they represent them. I think this is a fair benefit that we're able to create that has a direct then transferable benefit onto the league. The last is we are able to tell their stories. We're able to tell tell people these are the women that represents our sport. These are the things that they've done. These are the things they're likely to do. This is their story. These are the sacrifices they've made to become pro at this sport that you once tried and potentially at one point of time thought about going pro yourself. That is quite meaningful. That's what we do for men's sports. So I'm quite unclear as to why it's the case that these things are not likely to be effective. The point is, not only are these things effective, but they're also likely to be exclusive, because it's likely to be the case that there are various influences that makes it so that men are trying their hands at various other things. Because if it's true that the world is becoming, more liberal, then I guess more men in general are just doing various different things already. If it's the case that you have your local gymnasium, they're likely to be reaching out to you to promote these things already. If it's the case that you go to school, it's likely to be the case that school likely already recommends you to play these things. They say that they might potentially invest money into a competitive league for men, but I'm again unsure as to why is there a direct transfer then to monetization, whereas the case for us is just directly here. We're able to build that cultural relevance, to tap into that cultural code in women as of the moment already, and therefore monetize off an immense business potential. And I think the reason why this is more likely to be true is because at the start of the debate, they asked, why is it the case that women's sports are in decline? But they never actually answered why is it the case that it's in decline? Because women are not dying. So what is then the problem? I think Wayne gave you the comparative from the start. It's the case that there's always competing influencers because women can be turned away from sport watching due to other external, they pursue academic careers and they focus away from all these things. So it's always a battle between us trying to realign them back to this cultural thing that's significant to them, and then bring off to other things because of the fact that the cultural code is not as strong. Because women's sport isn't just cemented in history; it doesn't have that rich and illustrative parts of, like, people have been doing this for a very long period of time, and how this represents like the epitome of human achievements. We are trying to do that, and that has a direct correlation onto the performance of the league. Look, this debate is an actor debate. It's a business decision debate. It's guys as a social movement debate, but you cannot debate it as a social movement debate because the fellas at the league at this point don't really care about whether it's the case that there's going to be more men. What we want to care about is making money and making it so that we have a sustainable, certain way to invest our money. I think we've given you a better case for why this happens. For these reasons, please side with opposition.
Thank the opposition with that speech, and to close off the round, government reply.
Hey, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. This team makes two fatal errors. First, they are systematically unrealistic and uncomparative about what advertising can realistically achieve. And second, they have an incoherent account of women's motivations to participate in sport that is self-evidently from first opposition, circular, and intention. First, what can advertising realistically achieve? The opposition account in this debate is we need to stem the tide of women being bled out to male-dominated sports. But there is a mismatch between the analysis and operationalization of why they say this is happening and their proposed solution, advertising. At first opposition, it is that women's male-dominated sports like soccer are more lucrative, so there's more money in them and more viewership because sport itself is a male-dominated culture. The solution they then propose is that convince women that sport is a good safe space and there are role models in those sports. But by their own analysis of why women are bleeding out, that is not very persuasive. The question you then must ask in this debate is, what can advertising do for sport? It is fundamentally, as we say from first proposition, not to shout myself out, informing people about characteristics of a thing that they did not know about. It's not brainwashing, it's not magic. Like, we have to be realistic about the fact that most women know stuff about netball or about gymnastics, and they make decisions based on that. And advertising has severe diminishing marginal returns at that point. Our claim is men, due to the waning cultural relevance that both teams agree for the kinds of sport we're talking about in this debate, have not yet in many cases been provided a persuasive reason to care about a specific sport where they were already wanting to do sport in general. And we provide them with this advertising that we support that set of reasons. Either it is that these sports are vigorous forms of exercises that are whole body conditioning, or they have fun and novel rules like the scoring in gymnastics, or they're an opportunity to hang out with the other gender, which is something that lots of women and men want to do because, fucking spoiler alert, most people are straight and sports is quite erotic. Like, come on, this is just intuitive. And I think this claim is conceded in third opposition, that we persuade far more men to do the sport and that we don't persuade that many more women with advertising targeted at women, which means that given that this is an actor debate and we are arguing from the perspective of leagues rather than women doing the sport, getting people who are more motivated to fund and to care about the relevance of sport, to donate to it, to be members, to turn up to games, is just a debate-winning impact, and you can't concede it, right? Like, they just cannot. So I think that's really fatal for them. But even if you don't believe that, they have just the weirdest account of women's motivations to participate in sport. At first opposition, they're like, again, lucrative and money-making. And then at third opposition, they're like, well, women see themselves as inferior when forced to directly compare themselves to men, and that's why they're reigning in relevance. But again, these things are clearly in tension, right? To be charitable, maybe they're trying to speak about different groups of women, but the group of women who are bleeding out to men-dominated sports clearly can't be persuaded with advertising because, as we've already described, their reasons are different, and advertising that they're describing won't convince that set of reasons, women, because their reasons are rational and analytical, not ones they can be persuaded out of. The other group, though, maybe they stop doing sport in general because the safe space stops existing. Single-gender sports still exist. We're not abolishing them. And many women want to participate with men, so it's unclear that that happens in the vast majority of cases. But the point of my POI to 3.0 is just interest in sport is less correlated to skill, objective and absolute skill, than they think it is. Simone Biles is the most famous gymnastics athlete in the world because she's a role model, not because she's better than lots of men's gymnasts who already exist. And she won't cease to be if we start advertising to men that sports is interesting. We can advertise Simone Biles to them if that is the case. We just have to emphasize things that are likely to be persuasive to men, like that skill is hard or it's cool exercise, rather than it's girly and it's fun. So, in sum, they concede the debate at opposition block and they don't have a coherent account of women's motivations. Vote proposition.
Thank both teams for a fine debate. I'll just wait for OC to stop recording.